I'm very happy to introduce now our next speaker. Simha Goldin is Senior Lecturer in the Jewish History Department of Tel Aviv University and is their Director of the Goldstein Goran Diaspora Research Center at the Lester and Sally Anton Faculty of Humanities. Professor Goldin received his PhD in 1991 at Tel Aviv University. He contributed many articles and 5 monographs to the study of medieval Judaism, among them The Ways of Jewish Martyrdom, Jewish Women in the Middle Ages, A Quiet Revolution, and Apostasy and Jewish Identity in the High Middle Ages, Northern Europe. Professor Goldin will continue to trace or not trace the history of Jew hatred into medieval times. Professor Goldin, it's a pleasure for me to invite your talk on anti-Judaism, Jew hatred, and anti-Semitism.
Thank you so much. In the city of Bryn, in the year 3043, a Christian woman who had just given birth to a child attempted to sell her child to a Jew. When the latter reported the incident to the authorities, they asked him to stage a meeting and arrested the woman and her girlfriend. The court proceedings indicate that the woman had taken the action because the baby was, quotation, ready-faced and red-haired, and she knew that the Jew would murder the infant to use his body and blood for ritual and religious purposes. The 2 women were convicted and executed. According to the court proceedings, quotation, the mother of the child was buried alive, but the other woman only had her eyes turned out because she was pregnant. This conference is dedicated to understanding the roots and expressions of Jew hatred and anti-Semitism on the premise that tackling the subject is of seminal and essential importance. Being responsible for 2 of the panels discussing medieval anti-Judaism, let me talk briefly about some reflections that I made in my studies about the Jewish society and the Christian society and mutual societies in the Middle Ages. Up until 1960s, the study of history of anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism followed clearly set out lines. As an outgrowth of Judaism, early Christianity frankly claimed that it had replaced its older sister, and offered explanation of why the Jews and Judaism thus continue to exist. The Church Fathers based their opinion on theological doctrines that guided political and material interests. As Christianity grew from a small, persecuted minority into the religion of the Roman Empire, its stands were pressed into the service of political and religious rule. Tracing the Christian attitude towards Jews and Judaism, embodied in the theological writings of the popes and the theologians and historians, have sought to identify its roots and development. Traditionally, the relations between the 2 communities have been regarded as governed by Christian religious and theological principles. The public at large following the dogma laid forth by the Church. While scholars also studied the political and legal status of Jews during the Middle Ages, the fact that this was so closely entwined with theology precluded it from establishing itself as an independent subject of inquiry. Despite the theological dispute over the supremacy and triumph of Christianity and displays of overt hatred toward Jews in antiquity, the Church created a theological and legal framework to protect the Jews community within its midst. This rested on the argument made by St. Augustine, while demonstrated the disparity between tension between Augustine's thesis and its particular implementation in the Middle Ages, As a social historian, I am more interested in the extent to which Augustine's idea permitted Christian society as a whole. A third aspect that has been analyzed is the mob behavior, the asafsuf, such as the attack on the Jews during the Crusades or the question of blood libel. Many preserving this irrational, hysterical, prejudice-based outbreaks or mass violence is often seen separated from the discussion of medieval religious and political leadership, which scholars argue reflects a more rational behavior. The links between modern Jewish history and the after effects of the Second World War have led scholars to distinguish between various manifestations of the same phenomenon at the different times in history. During late antiquity, Judaism had to counter the claims made by pagan Hellenists. The rise of Christianity gave birth to a religious and theological form of Jew hatred. In the modern period, Jews struggle against racial anti-Semitism. The new generation of scholars has radically changed not only the subject but also means and method of study, challenging more of the concepts associated with the concept itself and their attribute to historical periods. The most significant methodological development who have taken a place, to my mind, embodies a deep desire to understand medieval Christian European society and its attitudes towards minority groups. In 1987, Moore's book appeared, The Formation of a Persecuting Society. Up until Moore's book, the repression of heretics, the harassment and killing of Jews, and the segregation of leopards from the mainstream society had all been regarded as separate, independent problems. As Moore demonstrated, however, Christian Europe treats each of these groups in precisely the same way. Hereby, he transferred the debate from the realm of theology to politics, positing that persecution is always a means to an end employed in the service of those in power. Whether sacred or secular, those who hold the reins of authority define others in such a way as make them into easily identifiable stereotypes. Thus, while not a real threat, they come to be perceived as a threat to social order. As mentioned here, David Nirenberg, 4 years ago, in a number of articles in his volume, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, maintains that anti-Judaism has existed constantly since the Jews first appeared through to the modern day. While anti-Semitism can only exist in the face of actual Jews, anti-Judaism can flourish even in their absence, because its target is an idea rather than a group of people. The idea of Judaism, which bears only a passing resemblance to the daily life and practice of Jews, has lain at the very center of Western civilization since its inception. Whether it has sought to define everything it is not, to put a name to its deepest fears, Judaism has been the go-to scapegoat. Rather than, and I quote Nirenberg, rather than archaic or irrational closet in the vast edifices of Western thought, he asserts, one of the basic tools with which that edifice was constructed. He thus adduced evidence of anti-Judaism in 4th century BC Egypt, and you have heard about it, so I can go on. Nirenberg's theory is supported by the work of various other scholars dealing with the Middle Ages. Anthony Bell's book, The Jew in Medieval Book, English Anti-Semitism After the Expulsion of the Jews from England, surveys the Jewish images and traits that populated English literature after the expulsion of the Jews in 1290. While the writer of this period had never even seen a Jew, they invented fictional, symbolic Jewish figures that played a significant role in defining Christian values, thereby delineating Christian ideal. Although Anthony Bell had no access to Nuremberg book, which only came out 6 years later, Bell addresses precisely the same phenomena, the rhetorical Jew, or we can say today the virtual Jew, an ideological construct that had as much or more to do with Christian as with actual Jews and Jewish communities. Taking on a life of its own, this supersede and or evacuate all traces of Jews in the flesh. Sarah Lipton similarly examines the images of the Jew in medieval art in her book Dark Mirror, The Medieval Origins of Anti-Jewish Iconography, which came 3 years ago. In her view, the caricature of a long, hawk nose, crooked back, thick-lipped, bulging-eyed, and white-belled Jew had no relation to real-life Jewish figures. Like other similar images of Christian art, it's replicate age-old images and concepts completely disassociated from current reality. The Jew only became visually prominent in the 12th century when the status of visual experience began to rise. Only one example of Sarah Lipton with respect to the so-called Jewish hat. Lipton likewise argues that no evidence exists that it ever constituted part of the Jewish dress during the early medieval period. She thus makes the far-reaching claim that it is a remarkable case of life imitating art, and not vice versa. However, this study of imaginary, virtual, symbolic, rhetorical, virtual Jew cannot on its own determine the agenda of research into medieval Jewish-Christian relations. All sectors of Christian society before the expulsion were intimately familiar with Jews who lived in their midst as their neighbors and worked alongside them in all sorts of trades. Here I would like to examine the distinguished nature of the Middle Ages, in particular the periods between the 11th century and the middle of the 14th, in relation to the emergence of Christian-Jew hatred and Jewish-Christian relationship. One of the most prominent features of this area was the catastrophic of the image of the Jew with the catastrophic combination of the image of the Jew with real Jews, a merger that led to a mother seeking to sell her infant to a Jew because she was convinced that he needed the blood of a Christian child for his ritual practices. Jews were regarded as inimical to Christian Europe on religious grounds. Christians believed them to have killed Christ and refused to accept him as a promised Messiah. They also presented a theological problem by continuing to exist after the establishing of the church. But from the 10th century onwards, they were the only surviving non-Christian minority in Europe. The pagan barbarian tribes had ceased being both pagan and barbarian, all converting to Christianity. The Muslims attacking from the West were an enemy that had perpetually to be kept at the way. But the Jews were thus the eternal other. The principle from protection extended to the Jews eroded over time, not only because its basic was unclear, but also because Christians perceived Jews as a menacing threat rather than innocent neighbors. The Jews protected by German rulers were given privilege, the right to live in German cities. In northern France, they possessed such economic power that the French monarchy was eventually forced to expel them from Paris before they took control of all the real estate in the city. In England, the economy lay at their mercy. All these circumstances conspired against the idea that the Jews were a minority whose rights must be defeated. At the end of the 11th century, when the first crusade set out, Christians entered the cities of the Rhine Valley and vented their fury on the Jews living therein. Overnight, these Jewish communities, which had enjoyed high status and great privileges, became the target of assault, giving the option of forced conversion or public execution. Both Jews and non-Jewish chronicles of this period describe this as a mob lynch. But was it? A Jewish chronicles record the way the Jews understood the Christian motives. Quotation, "You are responsible for killing our God. It is thus right that those who have taken it upon themselves to free his tomb from the hands of the Muslim infidels first take their revenge on those who killed him. Unless you convert, we are his descendants and we must avenge him." These statements reflect the fear of people departing on a long and dangerous campaign against the Muslim forces holding the Holy Land, unwilling to leave behind their enemies who might threaten them from the rear. The treatment meted out to the Jews must thus be understood as part of the Christian war against Islam. While the Muslims were afar off in the Holy Land, the Jews were right here. Faced with Christian attacks to share in a new world order, Jews had three choices: convert, participate, or become martyrs. The mob made a great deal out of the fact that God was on the side of the Christians and abandoned the Jews. Were the action and argument irrational? Of course not. While this was a mass outbreak, it was not a mob. Those who took part in the event knew precisely what they wanted: to undermine the position of the Jews in the cities and win a religious war before they set out to conquer the infidels at the other and the end of the world. Herein lies the distinguished nature of the 12th and 13th century. During this period, Christian Europe witnessed a rapid development of urban centers and the field of finance. These processes prompted many to attempt to halt the use of money, in particular the practice of credit, on which the rise of the cities rested. The option was led by churchmen and monks who struggled to adapt to the transmission from an agriculture-based economy to one predicated upon credit. They thus loudly protest the practice of interest, appealing to the biblical texts that denounce it and tracing those most openly associated with it, the Jews. They're extended everywhere, to cities built on the back of credit, to monasteries whose great wealth and economic power derived from the agricultural state, and even to the royal court, those political structure dedicated that monarchy dependent on sources for income of sustain itself. The Jew became the target of attention because their direct implication establishing credit and giving interest. Although a not significant stratum of Jews was engaged in this field, the people of northern France and England in particular identified them exclusively with it. The hatred this generated was based both on actual Jewish involvement in finance and vast wealth gained from them. The negative attitude toward Jews in the 13th century manifested its primarily with the political realm. The French and the English kings both rejected their Jewish communities. In England, the relationship between Jews and Christians determined when Henry III abandoned the idea that the Jews could serve as economic cornerstone of the English economy and state in favor of increasing attack against them. Edward I, who pursued a similar policy, began impoverishing them and then expelled them along together. I need to conclude, so I must tell you that I'm sharing the idea of Peter Scheffer about the Judophobia. He painted a picture of how Greeks and Romans perceived the threat of Jews, and in his book, he depicts the Christian attitudes toward the Jews as governed by hate and fear. A millennium after the Hellenistic period, in the 12th century, the primary motifs had completed change, now being Christ killers, money, and blood libels. The two principles motivating factors remain the same, however, fear and hate. The most striking manifestation of the combination of these two emotions was the blood libel, a story told about Jews that Christians bought whole scale. Herein the Jews was portrayed as a league with the devil, seeking to mortality harm the Christian world by kidnapping innocent children. The Jews thus possessed a danger to the Christian not only in past, when they killed Christ, but also in the present, murdering pure children for their blood in satanic guilt. What the conclusion? So I must conclude by these two words: fear and hate. So, as historians and people, Bnei Adam, we need to conquer those two words, fear and hate. How can we do it? So, like what we are doing now, taking another word, responsibility. Responsibility in Hebrew is achrayut. As any well-known know, the Hebrew is a divine language, so I need to say something about the word achrayut. Responsibility. In Hebrew, the word achrayut, beginning with the ot A, with the first sign in the alphabet, and finishing by taf, the last word. So all the word, all what we can say is in this word responsibility. The two signs is achrayut is aleph and chet, is ach, brother. The third sign is reish, so we get acher, the other. And the fourth sign is yud, so we get acharai, we need to lead. Thank you very much.